This is the Latin News podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia. I'm on the line to our very special guest this week, Mónica Serrano. She is a professor of international relations at the Colegio de México. She's a member of the board of the United Nations University. She's worked extensively in the fields of academia and security, violence, human rights, of course, in Mexico, Colombia, and the whole region. But thank you so much, Mónica, for your time and coming on the Latin News podcast.
Thank you, Richard. It is an honor and a pleasure to join you today for this.
It's our honor and our pleasure. Now, if anyone has not been aware of what's been going on in the news, well, the Mexican electorate made history on Sunday, the June 2nd, by electing the country's first woman president, Claudia Sheinbaum, and she triumphed in what we can only say is a landslide victory. But there are so many different questions that come from this. She is the president who has won the greatest portion of the vote in Mexico since Mexico entered its democratic transition. She's the first woman president and first woman president of Mexico to be able to declare that she won by the greatest margin as well. So this landslide has put her party, AMLO's party, so Lopez Obrador's party, Morena, into a really, really powerful position. I think the first thing that we need to ask you, Mónica, is she going to step out from AMLO's shadow? This is what people have been predicting, that she is very much AMLO's candidate. But is she her own president?
Let me first start by saying what I see as the positive lessons and the positive sides of this election. And I think the turnout very clearly indicates and it's a manifestation of the citizens' interest in the election and the democracy in Mexico. As important as that is the conduct of the elections as well, which to a large extent depend on citizens' participation. Those who are in the polling booths are citizens. Those who count the votes are citizens. So that is something that has to be really reckoned with and has to be acknowledged. Claudia Sheinbaum effectively won with a landslide, 59.4% of the votes, nearly 36 million votes, compared to the 27.9% of the second candidate, also a woman, we have to say, Xochitl Gálvez. So it is a difference of nearly 32 points between one and the other, two women who bravely ran for candidates. The victory of Claudia Sheinbaum came as a surprise to many. Not the victory itself, I have to clarify. I think most political analysts, the markets included, had already acknowledged that the victory will go to Claudia Sheinbaum. But it is the margin that came to a surprise and that is keeping political analysts and experts still puzzling and trying to come up with answers. And I think that is where your question fits. If Claudia Sheinbaum is somehow under the shadow of AMLO and Lopez Obrador, is partly because of the way the election took place, with the president intervening, the president, in fact, very much acting in the old pre-canon, with a new, if you like, a new modus operandi or way of applying the dedazo, but in the end, really having chosen her and decided that Claudia Sheinbaum had to be his successor. So that is where the question as to whether Claudia will be able to be herself. And I think that paradoxically, the landslide victory puts her in a more difficult position, because had she not won with a qualified majority in the Chamber of Deputies, that is now, I think, a given, there are still questions about the Senate, and there are questions as to how Morena will claim and demand the distribution of the last bit of seats. There is a clause that states very clearly that the party winning the majority of votes cannot go over a certain limit, and they are prepared to go over that limit. They have already been clear about that in Mexico City, and how they play that card in relation to the Senate is still to be seen. But the fact of the matter is that by approaching the qualified majority, she has less of an excuse to keep a distance or to keep her own views in relation to what AMLO has already set as an agenda, which is the number of constitutional reforms that AMLO has already flagged, which include a number of very tricky policies and decisions that will impact the institutional landscape of the country and of democracy significantly.
What I think is a good place to start as well is AMLO laid out this 20-point reform agenda in February. 18 of these reforms are constitutional reforms and involve measures such as the elimination of a proportional representation of seats in Congress and the direct voting of Supreme Court justices by popular vote, and the elimination of regulatory agencies. So we're talking about the potential for major constitutional changes that are now more likely to pass. And I get the feeling with that 1 month changeover, so the new Congress with its strengthened Morena bench is sworn in on September the 1st, and Claudia Sheinbaum is not inaugurated until October the 1st. So that gives AMLO 1 month to basically, I would say, push through absolutely everything he wants to do. Is this something that you believe will happen?
Well, he has already sent the signals that he's prepared to do that. He's again published the latest agenda for the 18 constitutional reforms. He's very clearly indicated that that should be the course of the deepening of what is called in Mexico the fourth transformation, to which, by the way, Claudia Sheinbaum in the course of the campaign committed herself to very clearly, to many of these changes and policy decisions, including the popular election of judges and ministers of the Supreme Court. There are other agendas in which she has kind of indicated or flagged a more moderate position, including in terms of the reform of the judiciary and the Supreme Court. She's already said that it has to be debated in a public parliament kind of way, suggesting that she's not necessarily running. But you are absolutely right in stating that to the extent that the new Congress will in fact start operating on the 1st of September, that gives AMLO a whole month to rush these constitutional reforms and to proceed with his radical agenda for change. I think September will be a very tricky month and a very interesting 4 weeks to look at how the relationship between the exiting president, who has been one of the most popular presidents in Mexico, that to be fair, he does not end in a note of approval much different to predecessors, with the exception of Enrique Peña Nieto. The approval rate of Lopez Obrador is above 50%, which is not very different to the approval rates with which Fox or Calderon ended. Cedillo, the one president who ended on a highest note of approval. But what places Lopez Obrador in a very particular light is the absolutely low approval rate with which Peña Nieto ended, 25%. So the perception of Lopez Obrador and the approval rate is not insignificant, but the elections as well, I think, are being perceived as a plebiscite on his government. Is not only the victory of Claudia Sheinbaum as a running candidate, but also the approval of the electorate of AMLO's government. And I think it will be very tempting for him to rush these reforms, but it will be very difficult for Claudia Sheinbaum then to assert her own ground if López Obrador decides to act in that way and not to allow the new government to be the one who processes and takes these decisions.
So I have a quick side question on that, because it is interesting to see how popular López Obrador, he's exiting this position and this role on a high note. To what can we attribute his popularity amongst the electorate?
Well, there is in fact a puzzle, and a puzzle that does not help explain the electoral results, and that is that while his popularity remained high with a slow downturn in 2020, but then he recovered swiftly, the approval rate, as I say, is high. But the approval of his policies, in particular security, shows a very clear contrast. The majority of those polled show a clear disapproval in terms of the security policies that were pursued under López Obrador, to which Claudia Sheinbaum has also committed herself. But again, I mean, that is where it's difficult to pin down Claudia Sheinbaum, because as mayor of Mexico City, her security policies contrasted clearly with the policies pursued by AMLO at the national level. So the approval rate, I think, is clear, but there is this paradox with the disapproval of his policies, and yet a landslide victory for Morena, Claudia Sheinbaum, and AMLO.
Well, I mean, as we said, the landslide victory for Claudia Sheinbaum and obviously second place, Galvez, is a huge victory in itself for, let's say, women's rights and exposure in a country of great violence and, of course, gender-based violence as well. And that leads us really into this security question in which you were talking about. You say that she contrasted definitely as mayor of Mexico City in terms of her security policy, but will she continue a policy of hugs, not bullets, across the country? Will we see her blindly pursue López Obrador's policy on that?
I think that is going to be hard on a number of fronts. The first that you have already mentioned is the U.S. factor and how the U.S. factor plays out. It will depend on the pressures coming from the White House, and that will in turn depend on the U.S. elections and whether Biden or Trump end up in the White House. Even under the Democratic government, we've seen some changes in the policy of abrazos no balazos of López Obrador, and the continuation of old policies, including the arrest or killing of big drug traffickers, as well as the extradition of some of them. The latest one of the security men of the Cartel de Sinaloa just a few weeks ago. So the US factor will indeed be something that we will need to take into account to assess the security policies of Claudia Sheinbaum. The problem that she has is that the policies that she implemented in Mexico City are policies that are not easily replicated in other parts of the country because of lack of resources, because of the nature of the city, with a population that has been voting and governed by the left and supporting left policies for a long period of time now, where technology plays an important role, where the size and the strength of the police force is unique in terms of the country, and contrasts with other places in Mexico where either police is non-existent in some municipalities or where police corps do not go above 2 policemen in some municipalities. So that makes it difficult, the perspective of replicating the agenda or the policy approach, the security policy approach in Mexico and other parts of the country is not easy. And there is, of course, the dimension of federalism, which also means that her margin of maneuver to export policies to other states or cities in the country will have to take into account that dimension, which would involve negotiating with governors. Having said that, we have to take into account that Morena now will be governing the majority of states in Mexico, with the exception of Guanajuato, Coahuila, and Jalisco. The majority of the country is now purple, Morena or Guinda, dark red. And that means that there can be, in principle, more coordination that could help a security policy than has been the case in previous sexennios, where the difference of party color has been a factor undermining security cooperation. So as to security, I think she said that the National Guard will continue. She has made very clear that the military will continue to play a part. How she will make use of these resources, I think it's something that we will need to wait and see. I think her commitment to social policy and the use of social policy as an input for security policies is likely to continue, not least because of the positive record that those policies showed in Mexico City, where the deepening of social policies in certain neighborhoods, targeting in particular young boys, young men, played an important and were perceived to have helped the security equation. So how she really tweaks these policies at the national level will be something that we have to wait and see, but it's going to be a major challenge, because where you have already systems of criminal governance very rooted at the local level, the capacity of these policies to make an impact will be, I think, something to be tested.
So you say on the one side that Morena is governing, I think it's 24 out of 32 Mexican states. that on the one side, this could be open, opportunities for communication and opportunities for collaboration, as you say, and on the other side, but as you say, the criminality so deep rooted in some of these areas and so few economic opportunities, then there's a huge challenge as well. I mean, nothing's going to be smooth sailing. We know that, but the challenges really do exist. And I think we should probably discuss just a little bit the potential for the elections in the US coming up November 2024. Now, interestingly, former President Trump had a reasonably good relationship with Lopez Obrador. And it's one of those things that sort of beggars belief. And you get the feeling that President Biden has, a decent relationship. But what can we see? What would we think between Claudia Sheinbaum and either one of these potential presidents?
I think that if we see continuity in terms of a democratic government in the US, it will be more easy to see a continuation, which doesn't mean to say that it's going to be easy, because the pressures are there. And we are seeing how, in the context of the elections, Biden is tightening migration policies, limiting the number of people who are allowed into the US to claim asylum. And that puts a hell of a lot of pressure on Mexico, on northern border cities, as well as in the southern border. And the expectation that Mexico helps contain the migrant flow increases. So that is something that will be there, that will probably be dealt with in a more civilized way, through dialogue, less through open, direct threats, but the pressures will be there. With Trump, I think, even if we in retrospect can see that Lopez Obrador political talents allowed him to exercise huge self-restraint not to respond to the provocations of Trump, which I think was a big factor in the rapport. And the way in which AMLO went at great lengths also to pay compliments to Trump, whether he really believes them or not, we'll have to wait for historians to be able to delve more deeply into that. But I think those were the kind of ingredients that allowed for the kind of less confrontational relationship than one would have expected between Mexico and the US under Trump. Claudia Sheinbaum does not have those attributes.
No.
She's a very disciplined politician, very organized. She's a kind of technocrat, but she's not someone who really has the charisma that Lopez Obrador was able to display. She doesn't seem to have the patience or the slow pace of interactions to which AMLO is prepared, and I think acted as an advantage to him when dealing with Trump, and that is something that we'll have to wait and see. The other thing is, AMLO had in Ebrard a very competent politician as a foreign minister. In bilateral dealings, perhaps not so much in how he handled the foreign service and Mexican foreign policy in general, but in terms of a crisis management approach, Ebrard was certainly a very competent and savvy politician. And so far, the names that have been mentioned for the foreign policy agenda and Mexico's international relations, I don't think have the type of experience that Ebrard had And even abroad, he was exposed later on by Trump and the memoirs of some of Trump members of Trump's government. So I don't think that the ingredients that were there to try to mitigate or to try to soften the roughest sides of a potential U.S.-Mexican relation under a second Trump are necessarily there.
Yeah, this is what is being stated in much of the media at the moment as well, and a lot being pointed at Claudia Sheinbaum's perceived inability to be as, how would you say, politically savvy as Lopez Obrador, as you suggested. I'm curious, as we start coming towards the end of our conversation here, there's a lot of negativity coming out. There's a lot of negativity in certain areas of the press, and it usually comes back down to the economics. On June the 7th, economic media sources in Mexico were reporting that the peso fell more than 7.5%. Its worst in 4 years. And then there are other suggestions that a continuation of Lopez Obrador's policies, obviously with the super majority that Sheinbaum now has in Congress, it revives concerns of a further deterioration of the country's macroeconomic fundamentals. I doubt that anything really is going to change in the rest of in the economy for 2024, but the downside risks, they're kind of growing, or they're suspected for 2025. I'd love to hear your views on this.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I failed to mention that explains the election is the massive amount of money that Lopez Obrador disbursed. Among, it is believed, as many as 35 million homes, not people, but families. And the sums of money that families received have been estimated to go between 5,000 and 11,000 pesos, which is roughly between nearly 500 up to $500 a month. And the other characteristic of this disbursement of money is that, unlike what was the case in previous administrations, which was institutionally channeled, this money was channeled through a new institution created by Lopez Obrador that clearly established a connection between those enrolling the people to receive the grants, the pensions, the transfers, and Morena and Lopez Obrador. So there is a kind of almost personal perception of these social benefits, which is really mere populism, and Morena and Lopez Obrador, which in turn were responsible for a significant increase in the deficit, in the public deficit. It is true that a lot of this money has come from what are called fideicomisos, kind of special trusts and budgets, lines of budget that were sitting for emergencies, including natural disasters, and they were diverted for these purposes. How Claudia Sheinbaum will continue funding these transfers, which are at the bottom of what holds Morena together, it's a question. And even before we put this question on the table, I think many are persuaded that a fiscal reform has long been due in Mexico. It's been debated for decades now, and that there is no way she will be able to continue with this type of policies that help keep Morena afloat without a fiscal reform. So far, she said no fiscal reform, but I think she will have to confront that sooner rather than later. As I said before, it is a kind of negative result to have won with such margin of landslide, both because of the way in which Lopez Obrador can push the reforms that will make markets uneasy, but also because of the way that landslide commits her to continue with this course of policies, and reduces perhaps her ability to fine-tune some of these. The markets have been interpreted as, in fact, reacting to this landslide victory. Markets had already accepted that she was most likely going to be the winner, but it was the landslide that made markets uncertain and wobbly. How she will deal with all this, we'll see, and a big factor will be the discipline within Morena, because the discipline within Morena has been very much kept together by the AMLO factor. And without AMLO being there, what we will have are currents, which I think is what is perhaps the one thing that makes Morena fundamentally different from the PRI, beyond all the similarities, including the caso. I think there is a lot of, including the migration of priistas to Morena, the number of priistas, governors, you name what. But one fundamental difference is that the PRI ultimately rested on a corporate structure that is true, eroded over time, but there was a kind of corporate structure that kept the PRI together and allowed for different policies to try to create some semblance of discipline. In Morena, what we have, I think, are currents. It's a mix of groups and political factions, including Ebrard, Sheinbaum herself, and what is considered to be the more radical part of Morena, Ebrard, Monreal. So how the discipline will play out, and how Sheinbaum will be able to recreate some kind of image of discipline will be also very important in terms of how the markets behave, and how the economy reacts.
Absolutely fascinating that the drop in the peso is down to the landslide. You'd think a landslide would keep it a level, but of course these things are different. I think we'll wind this down. I have one final comment. I was going to ask if Morena had become the new PRI, but you've already answered that. But my final question is, obviously, and a lot of investors, a lot of around the world, and businessmen are listening to this, and they're interested in the issue of Pemex. And for me, it remains to be seen whether the continued nationalist approach that Sheinbaum intends to implement, if it will turn Pemex into a financially healthy company. The country has bailed out Pemex over and over again. Is it possible that she will continue to heavily subsidize Pemex for 3 years and start a gradual transition into renewables, which is far more, let's say, her background?
She's indicated that clearly. If there is one policy area in which she has clearly departed from AMLO's preferences and track record of policies, is in renewable energy. How she manages Pemex AMLO's commitment to this nationalist energy agenda. We'll have to see. I think she's also, while showing commitment to renewable energies, and as I said before, this is not really my area of expertise, but
That's okay.
I think there are reasons in terms of how, under the PAN government's energy decisions, including with investors, in particular from Spain, were taken, and the corruption that accompanied those deals. I think that is a factor that clearly plays a part in her commitment to keep a state predominance in the energy sector. But that does not necessarily mean that she will continue with a fossil kind of policy agenda that we saw under AMLO. As I said, she has indicated her readiness to move towards renewables. In the campaign, she showed off how she, being mayor of Mexico City, she took the decision to install solar panels in one of the biggest public market in Mexico City. So she's signaled that that's her intention. And I think that Pemex needs to be looked at, and some tough policy decisions will need to be considered. How that will be played out, we'll have to wait and see.
Plenty of challenges ahead for President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum. Let me take this moment and say thank you so much to Mónica Serrano, who is Professor of International Relations at the Colegio de México. She's a member of the board at the United Nations University and has worked in academia regarding security, violence, human rights in Mexico and in the region. Thank you so much for your time and your insights in what promises to be an incredibly, well, I would say, colorful few years ahead for Mexico.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Hey, the pleasure has been all mine. We've been here for the Latin News podcast. My name is Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. Please remember to subscribe, share, and talk about the Latin News podcast. Thank you again for listening. We'll be back in a fortnight with further interviews from experts in the region. So, goodbye.
Bye-bye.